Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sport all around the world. My name is Shahlaei, and this is the 10th episode, the second one of our collaboration with the Iranian Women's Sports Law Association. In the previous episode, we examined what happens when athletes withdraw from competition or take a stand in moments of political or social tension. We saw that these decisions are never purely personal. They come with immediate legal, professional, and psychological risks. And in many cases, when institutions fall short, it's NGOs and independent actors who step in to provide support, guidance, and protection. But this raises a deeper question. If athletes are exposed to such risks, and if internal actors are the ones stepping in to protect them, then where are the institutions that are supposed to be responsible? Today's episode shifts the focus from individual experience to systemic responsibility. We will examine the role of national federations, international governing bodies, and broader governance structures in protecting or failing to protect athletes when sport becomes political. We will look at the tensions between autonomy and state influence, the limits of international intervention, and the structural gaps that leave athletes navigating these risks alone. Because ultimately, this is not a question of protection. This is a question of governance, of who holds responsibility, who exercises power, and who is left unprotected when the system is under pressure. To explore these questions, I am joined today by Faraz Shahlaei, a legal expert working at the intersection of sports law, governance, and athlete rights. Let's break it down. Faraz, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Before we dive into the core of the episode, I would like to start from your perspective. What led you to work at the intersection of sports law, governance, and athlete rights, particularly in politically sensitive contexts?
Well, thank you, Yunus, for having me for this podcast. Well, I was a volleyball player myself, so I played on a competitive level back in Iran, and I was a good volleyball player back then. But when I started studying law at the law school, I found myself in a good position to find answers to some of the questions that I had as a player. For example, what happens if the wrong call of a referee is going to change the whole result of the game, and all the efforts that athletes have put into, their endeavors for winning a medal or winning a competition? Is there a legal solution for those type of things? What happens if the economic rights of the athletes are affected by the decisions of the sport governing bodies, whether it's related to their eligibility for the competitions or their performance on the field of play or those type of things? When I started studying law and I became familiar with the concepts of international human rights law, I got really interested in exploring the intersection of sports and international human rights law. And that's when I started working on these issues. Specifically, I started with writing on the right to freedom of expression for athletes on the field of play. And the restrictions that were imposed on those type of gestures or expressions by the sport governing bodies, and then extended my research to other potential interactions between international human rights law, public international law, and sports, to discuss aspects such as, for example, the international responsibility of the states in cases of state-sponsored doping, or other issues such as the intersectional discrimination in the sports, whether it's based on sex and race or disability and race, and these type of intersections that frequently arise in the sporting disputes. So that was how I entered this field and started talking about these issues.
In the previous episode of the series with Olympian Nikki Dryden, we saw that NGOs often step in when athletes face serious risks after withdrawing or speaking out. But ideally, this shouldn't be the role. Like from your perspective, who is actually responsible for protecting athletes in these situations?
Well, I think I need to distinguish between two situations. First, when an athlete withdraws from a competition, and when an athlete chooses to use that platform to convey a message, to have an expression on the field of play, right? So these are two separate things, in my opinion, which might have their different backgrounds, stories, and histories, and also their different consequences. When we are talking about withdrawal from the competitions, that's a completely different debate. The athletes, by their own free will, a lot of times choose to take that stance to also, send a message that, okay, the framework that has been set up by this sport governing body is not in compliance with our values, for example. That might be a message that they want to send. But sometimes they are engaged in expressions on the field of play. They want to talk about their experiences. They want to talk about their feelings. They want to say that what is happening to them or their community or their people or to other people in other parts of the world is not something that they can remain silent about it. They want to express their feelings. They want to bring up injustices, structural discrimination, talking about peace, talking about human rights. And those are one of the most protected forms of expression and speech when it comes to international human rights law. The discussion of human rights has specifically been highlighted by the United Nations Human Rights Committee in their general comment on freedom of expression. And I can't see these type of gestures by athletes in support of peace, in support of inclusion, in support of diversity, against hatred, against xenophobia, against racial discrimination, and these type of things not to be a human rights debate. So by those type of gestures, they are actually engaging in expressions that are protected in the strictest form in most judicial territories or jurisdictions, and also under international human rights law. So if a sport governing body wants to interfere, impose sanctions, and somehow curtail the rights that athletes have, they are perhaps interfering with one of the protected rights for the individuals, which is the right to freedom of expression, and responsibility should be attached to those type of behaviors by the sport governing bodies. Who should intervene? Usually we see that, like Nikki has also mentioned, it's the NGOs that are, trying to engage. It's the academic scholars that try to engage, write about these things, bring up the issues, discuss how these type of practices do not comply with the norms and standards that we have in international human rights law. The sport governing bodies are largely out of the picture here. They are actually the ones who are trying to interfere with these rights. So they are the parties to these type of disputes, if I may frame it that way. Not the ones who are actually, we are talking, should protect the rights of athletes in these situations. And I think that is a thing that needs to change. The sport governing bodies at least with not interfering with these type of gestures, are the ones who have to take the responsibility. The problem arises when, they are trying to silence people. We saw the latest example from the Ukrainian athlete in the Winter Olympics when he tried to use the photos of I think some of his friends who died during the war and post those the stickers on his helmet, and then he was banned by the sport authorities. So this is when the problem arises. If that is a discussion of human rights, which I believe it is, then it should be protected. And that is when, we can say that a violation of international human rights law has happened. And that can be attributed to the state through the intermediary of the sport governing bodies. Aside from that, the sport governing bodies as private entities also do have responsibilities when it comes to international human rights law. Under the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, they do have an obligation to protect the rights of those who are impacted by their operations. And I think athletes will be a prime example of that.
My question would be like, we talk about the responsibilities the sports governing bodies and the national federations have, but if we talk in practice, how is it translated?
Well, in practice, we do see that sport governing bodies are actually justifying these type of interventions based on one of the core principles of the Olympic movement, which is the non-political context of the Olympic Games. And based on that, basic context, they justify these type of interactions. So this is one of the, controversial claims by the sport authorities that Olympic Games are not political and they cannot be used for political purposes. First of all, I don't know how we can frame an expression in support of peace, in support of human rights, in support of inclusion as a political act. So that is one thing. That's the first question for me. That is not a political act. They are trying to justify those type of gestures by saying that sport is not political. Olympic Games are not political. However, their own actions somehow contradict what they are trying to say in this regard. They cannot claim that sport is not political, but at the same time appear frequently next to the political leaders of the world. As an example, like if you have watched the previous FIFA Club World Cup in the United States, you saw that during the final game, we saw, a huge presence of a political leader during the context of the game, right? Or, as has been discussed, they frequently appear next to other leaders in the world and make those type of political connections with them. They are the ones who are making sport political, not the athletes with those type of gestures, whether they want to withdraw from the games or have an expression on the field of play.
Sport has always been political, and it will always be political. So the fact that saying that athletes shouldn't take a political sense is very much hypocritical from the governing bodies.
That is correct. And then I want to highlight another aspect of it. It is not only the political leaders that are using sport for their own purposes. The sport governing bodies are using that political, so they are opening the doors for those type of political debates, right? Why FIFA should give a peace award for the first time in their history suddenly, all of a sudden, right? Or what does the FIFA president do in the inauguration ceremony of the US president? Why the sport officials should be invited to a political forum that is created for peace in the Middle East, right? they are the ones who are making the sport political. If they want to keep sport clean, then they have to stay out of politics, right? They cannot themselves get involved in those type of behaviors and then ban athletes if they want to express something on a field of play in this regard, right?
Now I want to shift the topic to the national federations, national sports federations. Like in politically sensitive contexts, we can say sometimes the state interests shape the decisions of sports federations. And in this case, can we realistically speak about federation autonomy in these environments? And where does autonomy end and political pressure begin?
Well, I think to a large extent, it depends on the context, on the territory that we are talking about, and the political system that dominates the country. It will be very different if I want to talk about the United States, or Switzerland, or Germany, or let's say Saudi Arabia, or Iran, or other countries. So the political context is really important. A lot of times we see that sport governing bodies impose sanctions on national governing bodies because of the political interference by their states, right? So it is very different from one context to the other. If we are dealing with a political system that we know that they have that type of influence and pressure on the national governing body, then I think we realistically cannot expect a lot of openness from that side. We know that how that structure may work. We know that how the pressures may influence the decisions of the national governing bodies. So that is one thing. But then the question again turns to what should the international governing body says and say in this regard when they have this strict principle of non-interference from the political leaders, and they also, impose these type of sanctions on national governing bodies in those situations. We do have contradicting examples when it comes to these debates. Sometimes the pressure from the international governing bodies are helpful, are making a change, are reforming the processes of how the national governing body or a state may deal with their athletes. And we also have examples that those type of pressures have not worked and actually have created a backlash by the political structure of a country. And those who have suffered at the end were the athletes who lost the opportunity to compete because of these political tensions or other consequences that they have suffered because of losing that stage of the international sports.
But what are the tools that the international governing bodies and the national governing bodies, like the national federations, what are the tools they actually have to protect these athletes? And why do we see very little intervention? Is this a lack of capacity or a lack of willingness?
That's a very good question. I think it again goes back to what I discussed about the examples that we have. The sport governing bodies do have a leverage. They do have the power to ban states from being on that international stage. That's the stage that no state wants to lose. Okay, so a lot of times when they impose a sanction because of the behaviors of a specific country or national governing body, we do have examples that states have complied. An example that I want to bring here is, for example, the stadium ban on Iranian women in Iran. That was something that has been applied for a long time. And when FIFA decided to intervene after years of, discussions from different NGOs, human rights activists, the practice changed, right? So we do have that example that was successful. When FIFA intervened and tried to use their leverage, they were able to make a change, and the practice changed. They let women into the stadiums, despite all the history of all these regulations and practices. But we also have examples that these type of pressures have not been successful. Another example comes again from Iran when, for example, the International Judo Federation banned the national governing body of Iran because of political interventions, right? When they refrained from competing with athletes from Israel, and then they were banned by the International Judo Federation. What was the result? Did that change anything? In fact, no. They decided to lose at the stage, right? And they never changed their practices. So I think we do have conflicting examples in terms of what international sport governing bodies do in those situations. I think one answer to this goes back to the capacities that they have. Although that they do have this power, they do have this leverage in a lot of situations, we have to, I think, be realistic that a lot of times those capacities are really limited. When we are talking about their power on the state structure, right? They are private entities. From a public international law perspective, they legally cannot have an influence on the state structure. Right? We are talking about two non-equals, a private entity and a subject of public international law, which is state. Right. So what we need to expect from them usually is limited by these legal status under public international law, which they are non-subjects of public international law. They have no rights or obligations under international law, in the strict sense. And I think one of the, if we want to, have a fair observation here, one of the elements that have made this stage interesting for the states and have brought these private entities, the sport governing bodies, with this type of leverage has been this practice of trying at least to keep the sport stage outside of politics, right? That has been one of the elements that has contributed to the leverage, that the power that they have, they are accepted by almost all the countries in the world, regardless of their, political structure, the religious structure, their, judicial system, or any other consideration, economic primacy, whether they're from the, developing world or the developed countries. Why the sport governing bodies are popular for all these type of countries, that is one of the reasons, right? And they don't want to, substantially endanger that status that they have gained throughout the years by making any type of political intervention in a lot of cases. That's why we see the reluctance to do that in most cases.
Faraz, where do you see the biggest governance gaps today when it comes to protecting athletes in crisis situations? Like, we can talk about legal protection, non-retaliation, coordination. In your opinion, what is the biggest governance gap that exists now?
Sport governing bodies are private structures. They don't have the power to legally prosecute someone, for example, right? And they don't have the power to legally exonerate someone from something, that might have been a violation of the law. The gap that exists, I think, relates to the capacity that they have to provide legal consultation to the athletes, right? Instead of sanctioning them or banning them, what they can do is to provide this awareness, this knowledge to them ahead of time as those who are members of their family, that, okay, these are your rights when you are on the field of play. These are the consequences if you engage in these type of gestures, actions, or whatever you have. They do have this capacity, but unfortunately, a lot of times we see that they are not interested in using it. And I think that is the gap that can be covered by playing a more active and progressive role when it comes to the protection of the rights of athletes. So far, whatever we have seen from the sport governing bodies has been promises, has been words that really haven't translated into action. Maybe it's because of the actual determination of the leaders of the sport governing bodies, that they just want to create this face that, okay, we are trying to be human rights compliant, we are trying to provide these type of protections for the athletes. But when it comes to practice, we do see that those type of policies, those type of words lose much of their force, right? So I think a big gap is when they really don't want to be involved in these type of debates. They want to keep themselves protected, shielded against opening up the door for these type of human rights debates. And I think that's the biggest gap. So how this can change. I think one of the main changes that is happening, at least at the legal level, is the recognition that these entities are not purely private. They are somehow involved in the state apparatus. They are somehow can be framed a parastatal entity under the definition that is provided by the International Law Commission in their draft articles on the law of international state responsibility. We are not dealing with purely private entities. Right. So once we have this legal recognition, then the consequences can also change.
Okay, now we're gonna go back to the NGOs that we talked about earlier. Like we discussed how often they became the first responders in these kind of situations. Do you see the role as complementary to the system, or is it a sign that the system itself is failing?
Well, we do see the involvement of human rights NGOs in a lot of other contexts, right? It's not only sports. They are hugely involved in other contexts, whether it's transnational business, whether it's like...
But it's not the fact that they are involved or not. It's just that in the context of sports and athlete protection, I would say they are the first responders.
Yes, that is correct. So I think one justification or one reason for that is for a long time, sport has been considered as an area that had really nothing to do with human rights. No human rights violations have ever happened in sports. For a long time, that was the presumption, right? That, okay, they are athletes, they're doing their own thing, nothing is happening there. But things have started to change in, I think starting from the 2000s, things have started to change. And that can be also reflected and traced in the disputes that are being raised in front of the Court of Arbitration for Sports, right? Starting from around that time, we do see claims of human rights violations arising within the context of sport arbitration between the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And then this realization, occurred that what is happening in the sport? What was a catalyst in this interaction was several instances of the corruption scandal in the structure of the sport governing bodies that intensified the debates about what are the human rights implications of these organizations. And that is when NGOs came into the picture and started intervening. And I think that they have done a great job so far in terms of exposing the human rights issues that are there in the sports and opened up the debate, the door for, intervention and recognizing a responsibility for pressuring the sport governing bodies in terms of their human rights responsibilities. And that could not have been done without NGOs that are active in this field.
And do you think athletes' protection is applied equally across contexts, or are there clear double standards depending on the country, the sports, or the political system? Like, is there in practice a hierarchy in which athletes are worth protecting?
Well, I think that's a key question because one of the indications is the inconsistency that the judicial body or the judicial system that has been designed for resolving sport disputes has. We see a lot of inconsistency when it comes to human rights debates from the Court of Arbitration for Sport. A lot of times, when the human rights claims work in favor of the sport governing bodies, the CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, rules that, okay, these are human rights principles, we are going to, comply with them. But whenever those claims work against the sport governing bodies, the analysis change. And that is something that creates questions. Do we have double standards here? Where is the line? Why do we have inconsistency in situations that are completely similar, right? And that creates a lot of questions about whether this whole arbitration mechanism that has been created by the sport governing bodies is actually independent and impartial from their own system, from the sport governing bodies who are typically one of the parties to the dispute. And this question, I think, arises again, and it's a very fresh question that after the ban on the Ukrainian athlete for what he tried to do in the Winter Olympic Games, we do have clear guidelines from the IOC in terms of the freedom of expression. And then when the case arrives to CAS, we do see that double standard of, deciding again in favor of the sport governing body because of that ban. Therefore, I can say with, I think, quite a strong conviction that we do have double standards when it comes to protection of the athletes and their human rights by the sport governing bodies.
If we take a concrete example that happened 1 or 2 years ago, of the Dutch footballer Anwar El Ghazi, who had his contract terminated by Mainz after expressing pro-Palestinian views on social media about the Israeli genocide occurring in Gaza, we see how quickly an athlete's career can be impacted by taking a political stance. In situations like this, who is ultimately accountable when an athlete is sanctioned or loses their livelihood? And why is this accountability so difficult to establish and enforce in sport?
As sport governing bodies are the ones who have the responsibility to protect the freedom of expression for the athletes, whether on the field of play or on the social media in terms of the consequences within a sport. They are the ones who need to protect athletes. They are the ones who need to ensure and guarantee that if athletes want to talk, there will be no consequences in terms of their sporting career for them. That is the level. They do have the power to interfere in that level, and that is where we see that this type of support from the athletes is missing. I think the biggest problem in terms of bringing or introducing that accountability to the sport governing bodies in these situations is their private status. That they usually try to evade those type of debates by arguing that we are a private entity, we don't have any obligations under international human rights law. And as I discussed, and explained, this landscape is changing. They are increasingly recognized as those who have duties and obligations under international human rights law, whether it's under the framework of the United Nations Guiding Principles, or, as I say, for example, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights in the case of Semenya identified a vertical relationship between the sport governing bodies and the athletes. They clearly and explicitly pointed out that in this sphere, they are working like a public authority with regulatory powers over the athletes. So these type of recognitions, I think, is changing the status of the sport governing bodies, pushing them closer to the concept of parastatal entities, again, within the concept of public international law, which makes them much closer and much more accountable to their operations and the consequences of the regulatory powers over the athletes. That is the gap, and that is something that needs to be closed by the states or those who have this type of legal power in, over the structure of those sport governing bodies.
Okay, now let's zoom out, and I would like to end with a more conceptual question. Since this is called the Sports Governance Podcast, Faraz, how would you define the term sports governance today?
Uh, the sport governance is a very broad level of governance in this specific sector. We barely or rarely can see this type of influence and reach in other sectors, whether it's business, whether it's like, I don't know, any other business or sectors. When it comes to sport, the regulations are going far beyond the pecuniary interests of the individuals. They can intervene with their dignity. They can intervene with their privacy. They can intervene with their economic interests. They can intervene with their freedom of expression, with a lot of aspects that we don't see that type of regulatory or, governance power in any other sectors. So when we are talking about the governance in sports, we are talking about a completely different ecosystem, if I may, too. It has very distinguished features that makes them completely different from any other private entity that at least we have out there, whether it be a transnational corporation like Shell, those type of big business enterprises, right? Sport entities are completely different because of their impacts and the impact of the regulatory powers on the athletes. And that completely changes the landscape. We are talking about different entities. We are talking about private bodies who are actually replacing states and governments in a lot of aspects that were traditionally reserved for the states in this regard. States are not anymore the sole responsibles in the field of sports. Sport governing bodies have actually replaced them completely and totally. And that is something that makes this landscape and trajectory different, interesting, and worthy of more research and discussion. So that is how the governance of sport really distinguishes itself from any other governance structure out there.
As we come to the end of this episode, what clearly emerges is that athlete protection isn't simply a question of individual support. It's a structural issue rooted in how sport is governed. Throughout this conversation, we have seen that the responsibility to protect athletes formally lies with sports governing bodies. Yet in practice, these same institutions are often the ones limiting athletes' rights, particularly when it comes to freedom of speech, freedom of expression. We also explored how the idea of political neutrality in sport is frequently used to justify inaction or even sanction, despite the reality that sport itself is deeply embedded in political structures and relationships. At the national level, the picture becomes even more complex. In certain contexts, the autonomy of federations is heavily constrained by state influence, making meaningful protection difficult, if not impossible. And at the international level, while governing bodies do have leverage, their capacity and willingness to act remain inconsistent. What this creates is a fragmented system, one where responsibility exists in theory, but accountability remains difficult to establish in practice. This is where one of the central tensions of today's episode lies. Sports governing bodies operate as private entities, yet exercise powers that directly affect fundamental rights. And as Faraz highlighted, this evolving recognition that these bodies function in many ways like public authorities may be key to reshaping accountability frameworks going forward. At the same time, the growing role of NGOs shows both progress and failure. Progress in exposing human rights issues in sports, but failure in the system's ability to address them internally. So ultimately, the question isn't whether athletes need protection. That is already clear. But the real question is whether the current governance structures of sports are capable of providing it. And if they're not, then what needs to change? That's the challenge at the heart of sports governance today. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. Make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn. You were listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Shahlaei. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.